Jamie Bandle, a Washington State correction officer, was reported dead, strangled with a microphone cord in the prison chapel after being sexually assaulted by a prison inmate. And just like Bandle, here are 9 others by inmates. It's July 17th, 2020, and a 21-year-old former corrections officer is working alone, overseeing 64 inmates, but was allegedly attacked by an inmate who grabbed her from behind and sexually assaulted her at knife point. Eric Dehart, 29, was already serving a 30-year sentence for armed robbery and an additional 5 years for burglary at Elaine Hunt Correctional Center. And on July 17, 2020, he was charged again, this time for aggravated after correctional officer Deshunta Miller accused him of sexual assault. If convicted, Dehart was to face life without parole. Now, Deshunta Miller had filed a lawsuit against the Louisiana Department of Corrections, LADOC, claiming that faulty equipment, including defective cell locks and a malfunctioning beeper, contributed to her inability to prevent or alert others to the attack. Now, what made the whole thing worse was that everything that should have been in place to protect Miller that day had failed her. Although the prison security camera had caught much of the incident, showing Dehart as he forced Miller into a violent assault, leaving her with no backup and no way to stop what was happening, her lawsuit against the LADOC had the department arguing that her injury should have been handled through the workers' compensation system, rather than through civil litigation. So despite this horrific assault, Dehart, who was already incarcerated at the time, wasn't criminally charged for his crime of sexual assault. However, Miller was later fired for allegedly having a consensual relationship with another inmate, and she faced criminal charges for official malfeasance, a serious charge for misconduct by a public official. That sparked outrage, raising questions about the handling of the case and whether or not proper investigative procedures were actually followed. Authorities concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges against Dehart, despite the severity of the allegation. The case would stir public debate over the vulnerability of correctional officers, especially women, in environments where they are exposed to potential abuse or coercion. It also highlighted the complexities surrounding power dynamics in prison settings, where lines between consent and coercion become blurred. Now Miller's facing legal consequences for her actions. The unresolved accusation against Dehart leaves a cloud of uncertainty over the whole situation, but it does raise broader questions about accountability, justice, and the overall treatment of correctional officers in the penal system. Jessica De La Cruz filed a lawsuit against the City and Bronx Supreme Court, seeking compensation for emotional trauma and damages. Why? Well, she had a disturbing encounter with a prison inmate, which could have been prevented if the prison authorities took her seriously. We have Jessica De La Cruz, a former correction officer at Rikers Island, finding herself in a harrowing situation during a late-night shift on November 12, 2021, that would forever change her life. De La Cruz, then 40 years old, was working in one of the clinics, transferring inmates, when she encountered Michael Cleaver, an inmate recently arrested for burglary, harassment, and menacing. It was just after 2 a.m. when the unthinkable happened. Cleaver, standing at 5'6" and weighing 210 pounds, aggressively grabbed her upper body and breast. De La Cruz, with a quick reaction, managed to push Cleaver back into his cell and lock the door. Despite calling her supervisor, no one came to assist her. Deciding to close the clinic for her safety, De La Cruz tried to manage the situation alone. But Cleaver wasn't done. He made another attempt to escape, pushing against the door like a football player, desperately trying to attack her once again. Well, she fought him off, relying on her strength and some pepper spray, while the nurses cowered in fear. With no partner to assist her because her partner had been reassigned, De La Cruz was left to defend herself. A male officer eventually arrives, but Cleaver already pushed him aside and lunged at De La Cruz once more. Despite her small stature, she manages to fend him off until true help finally arrives. In the aftermath, De La Cruz found herself in a shock, crying from both the trauma and the pepper spray. What came next was a disturbing encounter with an assistant deputy warden who, rather than offering comfort, laughed while watching security footage of the whole thing, mocking the fleeing nurses. So adding insult to injury, he told her not to tell her husband, a remark that left her confused and disheartened. Hours later, Cleaver allegedly attempted to rape a 51-year-old nurse, a crime De La Cruz believes could have been prevented if her initial assault had been taken seriously by her supervisors. Reflecting on this incident, De La Cruz expressed frustration, noting that had her attack been properly addressed, Cleaver would have been restrained and the attempted rape might have never happened. Now suing the city for emotional distress and damages, De La Cruz hopes the case brings about a change in how female officers are protected and supported in the aftermath of such traumatic incidents. In 2014, Rachel DeStefano, a correctional officer at Kern Valley State Prison in California, was working in a housing unit when she ended up alone with a dangerous inmate who put her through a terrifying ordeal. Now, the attack didn't only traumatize DeStefano, but also exposed serious flaws in how safety measures were handled for correctional officers, especially for the women in this place. The fact that she was left alone in such a high-risk environment and her communication equipment had failed really highlighted a glaring underlying issue within the prison system. Following the assault, DeStefano took legal action against the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, holding him accountable for the lack of proper staffing and faulty safety equipment that really left her vulnerable. This lawsuit brings attention to the risks correctional staff face, more specifically in environments with dangerous inmates. This case spurred broader discussions on the importance of better training, staffing ratios, and reliable emergency communications tools. And as a result of this, there was a push for reform aimed at improving safety protocols to maybe prevent similar incidents from happening again, ensuring that staff like DeStefano would be better protected while performing their duties within the prison. In 2015, after enduring several terrifying ordeals from the hands of prison inmates and co-workers alike, Paula Purdy, a correctional officer working at Denver County Jail, took a decision that wasn't just detrimental to herself, but probably to her family as well. Starting in 1994, not long after she began working at the jail, Purdy endured a hostile work environment where male colleagues made demeaning and inappropriate comments about her body. She said she reported the behavior to her bosses, but those reports were met with few consequences.
I would get emotional at work several times a day,
she said. One particular male captain made her so uncomfortable that she actively avoided him. However, the worst harassment wouldn't come from her co-workers, but from inmates. And as Purdy made her rounds through the housing areas, she was often subjected to a lot of sexual remarks and explicit acts like inmates masturbating in front of her. Purdy reported that disturbing behavior to her superiors, but again, little or nothing was done to address the situation at that time. Over time, the harassment only intensified, and the lack of consequences took a heavy toll on her emotional and psychological well-being. She found herself breaking down at work frequently due to the stress and trauma from the ongoing abuse. Now, Purdy's fears didn't just remain within the prison, it extended beyond, and the constant harassment by inmates made her real anxious about her safety in public, particularly the fear of running into one of these men outside the facility. You see, as a single mother, she felt trapped in her job, unable to leave because she needed financial stability to support her family.
It's not like you can up and quit,
she said. Yet by 2015, after enduring years of abuse with no meaningful changes to her work environment, Purdy made the difficult decision to retire early at the age of 55. Now, while this meant she would receive a reduced pension, it was a sacrifice she felt necessary in order for her to escape that toxic environment that had become her workplace.
The union says the 10-year veteran female officer was supervising 2 tiers, which can hold as many as 130 inmates, when one of them pushed her into a closet, sexually assaulted, and severely beat her.
In 2018, an inmate attacked and sexually assaulted a female correctional officer whose name was never mentioned due to shame from the incident, while she was on duty at the Patuxent institution in Jessup, Maryland. According to the Maryland Department of Corrections, the incident occurred during routine inmate movement early Friday morning. The female officer was escorting the inmate to his kitchen duties when he forced her into a closet where the officer was sexually assaulted and seriously beaten. The officer was left in this closet for over 2 hours before another staff member found her. Following the assault, she was taken to the local hospital for medical care and has since been able to identify the inmate responsible. This troubling incident has prompted the department to review its procedures and staffing levels, more specifically regarding the supervision of high-risk inmates. You see, at the time of the attack, the officer had been overseeing 2 sections of the prison, which housed more than 130 inmates. At this point, the department points at staffing shortages as the cause for this kind of stuff, but it's only a basic explanation that even the prison authorities deny. In this ongoing investigation into the brutal incident, the department stated that they were considering legal action against the inmate based on the results of the investigation. Meanwhile, they've acknowledged the need for better safety measures to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Now, in light of this incident, the department has also started working tirelessly to improve both the supervision of inmates and the safety of correctional staff.
As a corrections officer, Hobbs says she was exposed to harassment daily. Jones experienced sexual abuse while taking inmates between holding cells and courtrooms.
After enduring years of sexual harassment from inmates, longtime female employees of Cook County Jail decided to retire in 2019. First was Dennis Hobbs. The harassment often began as soon as her shift started, with male inmates seriously and viciously exposing themselves to her. Over a span of 12 years as a correctional officer, Hobbs said this type of behavior became routine.
My workplace conditions deteriorated.
Hobbs said,
Indecent exposure and public masturbation became commonplace and the norm.
Despite filing numerous complaints, she was met with indifference. One time they told her that nothing could be done because an inmate was inside his cell. On another occasion, a supervisor told her that it was a compliment. Hobbs wasn't alone in her experience. Alongside her was Esther Jones, a sworn deputy sheriff, who also faced regular harassment from inmates. For Esther, it was like working in hell.
I feel like I lost my humanity. It totally changed me as a person. I became fearful on my job and no longer felt safe or supported.
The emotional toll of enduring such behavior, combined with the lack of support from the administration, really contributed to their decision to leave their respective jobs. Both women, along with other female correctional officers, became part of this large movement to fight back against these conditions. They were involved in class action lawsuits that argued Cook County Jail failed to protect its employees from the pervasive sexual harassment they faced daily. The lawsuit drew attention to how poorly the prison system handled complaints, especially when it came to ensuring the safety and well-being of female officers. And as the case gained serious momentum, over 1,000 jail employees were included as plaintiffs, seeking justice for the hostile environment they had endured. The court granted an injunction that required the jail to implement better protections for its workers, marking a significant step forward toward the safety of correctional officers. However, the road to justice wasn't straightforward. An appellate court later ruled that the lawsuit couldn't proceed as a class action due to the varying levels of harassment experienced in different parts of the jail. That ruling highlighted the complexity of addressing workplace harassment in such a large institution, leading to further legal discussions on how to approach these cases and better the lives of the likes of Denise Hobbs and Esther Jones.
Now a new source, an anonymous female guard, has come forward with claims that she was actually raped by Atala at Gilboa while commanders turned a blind eye to the incident.
After a long span of enduring the worst treatment possible from a prison inmate with no intervention from authorities, Yael did what most couldn't do. However, the fight she embarked on was one of solitude. Yael, an IDF soldier stationed at Gilboa Prison, never imagined the nightmare that would unfold during her service. Gilboa is notorious for housing both criminal and security prisoners, but it was in this security wing that Yael's life took a terrifying turn. Initially, she worked in a criminal wing, but her duties occasionally brought her in contact with Mohammed Attallah, a Palestinian terrorist serving a life sentence. Attallah had considerable control over the prison, to the point where the staff followed his orders. He noticed Yael and began to make suggestive comments, asking,
"When are you coming to work for me?"
His unwanted advances escalated when she was assigned more frequently to the wing he controlled. Despite her discomfort, the authorities ignored her protests. Yael did what many victims are often advised to do. She spoke up. She reported the harassment to her shift commander and even filled out a formal complaint. But instead of receiving support, she was silenced. The intelligence officer who should have taken action dismissed her concerns, focusing instead on finding another female guard to work in that wing. It became clear for Yael that her safety and well-being were not priorities. Now, Atallah's eventual transfer to another prison did little to ease Yael's suffering. Her complaint, which she hoped would bring some accountability, was just swept aside. Now, the prosecutor's office pursued charges against Attallah, but the prison staff who allowed that abuse to occur faced minimal consequences. The intelligence officer received only a reprimand, a far cry from the justice Yael deserved. Despite recommendations that he was unfit to serve, he was simply reassigned to another position within the prison system. So left to deal with the aftermath on her own, Yael found herself isolated. The prison system, her colleagues, and even the media seemed indifferent to her worries. In a crowdfunding appeal, Yael shared her anguish, describing a prison controlled not by the authorities, but by a terrorist with the freedom to harass female guards, without fear of being punished. She showed the systemic failure at Gilboa Prison, just like many others, where corruption, fear, and a lack of accountability had left her vulnerable to abuse. Yael's fight for justice continues, but it's a battle she's been forced to wage alone, without the institutional support she should have received from the very organization that was supposed to protect her.
Inmate Omar Best Thursday afternoon, moments after being charged with innocent charges. The criminal complaint form brutal and scary for the reported victim. Police say on July 25th she was working in a housing office at the Rockview State Prison when Best came in to empty her trash can, but instead he suddenly strangled her and her.
The story of a female prison employee at Rockview State Correctional Institution who endured a horrific attack by inmate Omar Best, a state prison inmate with a history of sexual violence, is a story you're not ready for. July 25th, 2013, the 24-year-old victim, whose identity remains protected, was working in her office within the prison. She had likely trusted that the precautions in place would ensure her safety while working so closely with dangerous inmates. However, Best, who had been convicted of multiple assaults before, somehow ended up alone with her. The attack that followed was vicious and relentless. Best overpowered her, brutally assaulting and raping her, and strangled her for a harrowing 27 minutes, leaving her for dead. This ordeal could have lasted even longer if it wasn't for a maintenance worker who happened to enter the office and interrupted the attack, likely saving her life. This horrifying incident raised serious questions about why Best, given his violent background, had access even remotely close to the area where he was left alone with a staff member. Even more alarming was the fact that Best had even been transferred to Rockview despite his previous convictions, including 2 other sexual assaults. So following the attack, Best was charged and sentenced for his crimes, but the damage had already been done. The prison employee's life was forever changed, not only by the trauma, but how does she trust the system that failed to protect her? As she later sued the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, claiming that their negligence allowed this assault to happen. This underscores the risk prison staff face, more specifically in facilities that don't offer protection against dangerous individuals like Omar Best. January 31st, 2011, Jamie Bandle, a Washington State Correction officer, met a grim fate in the hands of a prison inmate, Byron Scherf. the most unsettling fact was what befell her could have been prevented if only her concerns were taken seriously. Jamie was a dedicated corrections officer at the Monroe Correctional Complex in Washington, where she worked for nearly a decade. She was known for her professionalism and commitment to her job, even being named Officer of the Year in 2008. Despite her small stature at 5'3" and 130 pounds, Bandle was recognized for her capability and strong work ethic. However, she often expressed concerns about her safety, mostly regarding her isolated post in the prison chapel. She would continue voicing her worries about working alone in that chapel, and the fact that the security cameras were non-functional. Unfortunately, nothing was done about that, leading to tragic consequences. On January 31st, 2011, Bandle's worst fears became reality. During a routine prisoner head count, it was discovered that one inmate, Byron Scherf, a convicted rapist serving a life sentence, was missing. Now, he was found near the chapel lobby, but claimed he had planned to escape and changed his mind. Hours later, when Bandle failed to turn in her equipment after her shift, they attempted to reach her by phone, but without success. It was after a brief search that officers found her lifeless body in the chapel. She'd been strangled with a microphone cord, and efforts to revive her were unsuccessful. Her death was ruled a homicide by asphyxiation. Scherf had been in the prison system since 1997, but despite his dangerous past, he'd been downgraded to medium security in 2009 due to good behavior. But we could see that was bullshit. This sent shockwaves through the prison system and beyond. It was the first killing of a corrections officer in Washington since 1979. In the aftermath of Bandle's murder, there was an outpouring of grief from her colleagues and the community. Many were left angry and frustrated, believing that her death could have been prevented if her repeated warnings had been taken seriously. Union representatives and co-workers criticized the prison's staffing policies, particularly the decision to have a lone officer in such vulnerable positions. Jamie Bandle's murder became a catalyst for changes within the corrections system, but it came at the tragic cost of her life. She was remembered not only for her dedication to her work, but also for the loss of true potential.